Those of you who are back already, we're going to get started in about 1 minute just to make sure other folks are all back with us. I want to make sure also that we have all the roundtable folks. I see Dr. Rubin, great. We need Dr. Randhawa and Linda Goller-Blount. I wonder if Linda is with us yet. Hi, Emily. There she is. Hi, Linda.
Hi there. How are you?
Good.
Good.
All right, just a few more seconds as we let other folks come back. Dr. Mackey and okay. At least it's a Friday afternoon, so after a long Zoom day, whatever your favorite beverage is, time here on the East Coast. All right, let's go ahead and get started again. It's going to be interesting to talk about the coming issues. And I do have, hope we have everybody. I see Jay McKnight. Hi, Jay. And so I think we still have Dr. Robin with us. Brad, are you with us? He should be. I see Dr. Mackey with us.
I'm here.
Okay, great. All right, please go ahead and put yourself back on camera. So now we're going to do the policy roundtable. I want to introduce the members of the roundtable. Remind the New England CEPAC that you can still raise your hands if you wish to try to help me see you if you have a comment or a question of the roundtable as we go through it. But I'm going to have a conversation with folks about where we go from here. I mean, we've just had a great discussion of the context in which these new agents have been introduced, the unmet need, the broader impacts, the evidence, and we've had votes on all of that. And so now it's time for us, I think, to talk a little bit more about what's really going to happen and what we can do to set the stage for making sure that these interventions are introduced in the best way possible. Again, for the patients certainly who will be using them, but as we think broadly about what's to come in the future with both research and the pricing and innovation for other drugs for patients with lupus, we want to keep all of that in mind. So as part of this conversation, we will be joined by the folks who've already been with us at the table, and that would be Ms. Arnston and Ms. Felix, and we have the two clinical experts, Dr. Rovin and Dr. Mackey. So let's introduce the new folks. First, Linda Goller-Blount, please introduce yourself to people.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. I'm Linda Goller-Blount, President and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative, and you've all heard a little bit about the organization already from Tammy Boyd. And I'll just reiterate that Aurinia is a member and contributor to the Rare Disease Diversity Council, of which we chair. But happy to be here and happy to have this conversation.
Thank you very much. Jay McKnight, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thanks, Steve. Jay McKnight, I lead the pharmacy and pharmacy clinical and specialty strategies here at Humana. Great to be with you guys.
Thank you. Is Dr. Randhawa with us yet?
I am on. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Hi, good afternoon to all of you. I'm Simrat Randhawa. I'm a full-time employee of Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. I've been with Aurinia just about 4 years, so I've been really involved in the development program. So hopefully I'll be helpful to all of you in this next session, and just really a very sincere thank you to our patient advocates for sharing those very compelling stories. I can say I was very, very happy to be off video at the time.
Thank you, and we agree. And we have, where is it? There we go, Bernard Rubin. And Bernard, you gave a public comment, but please introduce yourself again.
Sure. I'm a full-time employee of GlaxoSmithKline. I'm also a rheumatologist.
Thank you. And Emily, I'm Emily Sau.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily, and I am a clinical pharmacist at Premera Blue Cross. I primarily oversee utilization management.
Okay, thank you all for being here. We've got about an hour and 15 minutes, and an hour and 10. And just in the general broad strokes, what I'd like to do is to probably start with kind of some broader aspects about health inequities and this kind of condition. Then I talked a little bit about clinical considerations, and so the conversation may kind of pivot from patients to clinical experts to a certain extent. And then we'll want to dive into what happens inside a payer, an insurer right now, as they try to look at the evidence and try to think about the pricing? What happens when they make a formulary decision about these treatments? What's going to go into their thinking, and what can we kind of use from today's meeting to help inform that process? And almost at the tail end, but probably not all the way at the tail end, the manufacturers, we're going to want to talk about your view of the arc of development in this area, but also about what can be learned about the ways that the evidence was generated, that the pricing was determined, because we have prices for these agents now, and what can we learn again, and what kinds of recommendations for the future might arise out of those considerations. So I may ping back a little bit, back and forth. When I do this in person, I wander around the room, and it's kind of easier because I can lean into people and kind of keep things light. But part of my job is to be a little bit provocative, because otherwise I'm sure that none of you have anything interesting to say, and I might have to poke you, right? So consider yourselves poked early and often, and know that part of this is, again, just to help, in a sense, our whole country have better conversations, more transparent conversations about many of these issues, which are so central to the lives of patients, their families, and all of us. So let me start where sometimes gets end up at the end of the agenda. I want to start with, from the patient perspective, the patient advocacy perspective, what would we need to do this right, to have these two interventions be introduced into the health system, to do the most we could to reduce health inequity in the United States in particular? So what would have to change? What would have to be different from what's happened in the past, or what are the best practices that we want to make sure that we keep doing? What should we keep our eyes on as we talk about the money and the coverage and everything else? What in the bigger picture do we need to think about to make sure we get this right? All right, Kathleen, please.
Thank you. We need therapies for lupus that are accessible and affordable. For rare diseases and diseases of unmet need with no therapies or very limited therapies, it's a very unique population. And it's not a one size fits all. And with payer utilization management policies out there right now, they treat all these diseases as equal, it seems to us as patients. We understand that healthcare costs are out of control, and that we should all play a part in helping to reduce them. Hey, we don't want to pay higher copays for brand drugs if we don't have to. And if an older drug does work, that's okay. But it shouldn't be at the expense of a patient's well-being. Different protocols that are in place force patients like step therapy to try and fail preferred treatments that can be ineffective or result in adverse reactions, and then copay accumulators that preclude individuals from using copay cards, coupons, or other cost-sharing programs to cover their out-of-pocket expenses are two of the most significant obstacles. I am so happy to be here to share my step therapy story with actual payers and have them at the table and have my voice be heard at this table. So thank you for that opportunity. I will try to be as succinct as possible, if that's okay.
Absolutely. But I tell you what, I'm going to come to step therapy as a separate topic in just a little bit. So
okay, so I can add to it then. So my final remark would be, all of us need to roll up our sleeves, be at the table together, all stakeholders, and have open, transparent conversations to solve the problem of high healthcare costs. And all of our voices need to be respected and heard. We need to look at atypical, unique patients, which many autoimmune and rare diseases are, and we need to look to precision medicine and actually having biomarkers and targeted therapies that don't ablate the entire immune system and cause permanent damage. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, Linda, you haven't had a chance to chime in yet, so I want to give you a shot at this, and think both specifically about lupus, if you will, but feel free to range more broadly.
Yeah, I think you mentioned health inequities, and the research that was presented here, as is usually the case, assumes a certain set of experiences, actually assumes a common set of experiences among patients, which we know doesn't exist. So it is often not the drug, and frankly, with these two drugs, we don't have enough evidence to say anything about what it means for Black patients anyway. But what's more important here for this conversation is the experience. We don't actually enjoy the same or a common set of experiences. So that to answer your question, really we have to look at provider behavior. We know the journey from symptoms appearance to diagnosis to therapy is longer for Black patients. And there are a number of reasons why: access to care, the time it takes to even follow up, whether it's step therapy or anything other. It takes time off from work, childcare. There are other indirect costs, but there's also provider bias. Providers are less likely to make certain kinds of recommendations for Black patients than for their white patients. So we really have to, when we're considering research and therapeutics, whether it's for lupus nephritis, which might seem obvious because of the disproportionate impact on Black people, but it's not. But that doesn't make lupus nephritis any different. This is true in general. We have to look at what that journey is like, what might influence that journey, what might encourage providers to think, to make certain recommendations, to perform certain tests, to follow a certain diagnostic pathway for their Black patients and not make decisions for them. We see this all the time. The assumption that the patient can't do this or won't do this or can't comply, or a number of decisions are made on behalf of the patient without first consulting the patient. And who loses in the end, of course, is the patient, who then gets a late stage diagnosis where therapeutics are less likely to be helpful anyway.
Thank you. And Christelle, how do you see this? I mean, as you see new exciting treatments coming in, that sense of celebration, that I mentioned at the beginning, I think you said you were a little bit worried, or people start wondering, will I be able to get it? And I mean, when you think about how, poor people without great health insurance, when you think about people of color, others, how do you think systemically we can get this better with these treatments?
Yeah, well, I do a lot of work educating patients about clinical trials and about clinical research. So when the news about belimumab for lupus nephritis and voclosporin were announced, I was really excited to share this about with my program participants. And I'm going to be honest that I did not immediately think about that roadblock in terms of would patients actually get to have the medicine. And I think, to echo what Linda said, a lot of treatment options that were offered kind of depends a lot on our providers. And I'm really, really lucky that I have a really great relationship with my doctor. But I think about all the time, where would I be if she had offered something different versus the thing that happened to have saved my life, So I think, again, to echo what Linda said, in terms of how doctors approach the process and approach conversations with their patients, even in terms of, doctors talk a lot about compliance and medication adherence. So I think I'm really interested in what that conversation is like, doctor and patient conversation, because I hear a lot about patients not taking their medications, but I don't hear about what happens next, how to fix that. So even, I know that the grant conversation is about getting the medication to patients, but even then making sure patients are able to afford the medication once it's prescribed and take the medication once they are able to buy it. So I think it's a really, it's not a really simple answer, but I think the conversation should be between doctor and patients, and not making certain assumptions.
Okay, thanks. Actually, let me ask the clinical experts. In your view too, in terms of trying to roll these out as new interventions in a way that will help make sure that we maximize our chances of improving health equity, are there major changes that need to happen in the way that doctors learn about these new treatments or that patients learn about them. We've had other situations in which people said, don't try to go through the doctors, go through other organs, churches or community groups or other ways to reach patients directly that they will trust and that they kind of will learn better from about how to empower their own decision making. Or what? I mean, is this something that you see as a problem? Do you see patients referred to you where you just shake your head and you say, what's going on out there in the community? They just really aren't getting it. How do we get it right with these two treatments? Because I would guess from your perspective, the vast majority of patients who qualify should be on one or the other.
You want to start, Megan?
Okay, I think that's a great question. And I really loved listening to Linda and Christelle. I think there's so many facets here. And I should say I have spent my whole 30-year career so far in the Bronx. And am very, very familiar with a lot of I would say all these issues. And in my dream of dreams, it would be to have a team approach that the lupus clinic involves not just physicians, but social workers and mental health therapists and dietitians and physical activity specialists, because it involves everything. And I think the critical thing here that Christelle brought up too is adherence. And if there is any kind of distrust about medications, and we're not even talking about research now, just about medication use, it's all about education. And it's also about education of physicians to sit down and ask the patient, what do they think? But first they have to explain it. So physicians need time. They need time in the clinic to go through these new drugs, what's involved, what are the pros and cons, which one do I suggest and why, and what does the patient think? I think education is vitally important. And the only other thing I want to add to that is, from a physician perspective, somehow making it a little bit easier to actually prescribe the medication with the prior approval process. That is enormously time consuming, and it can take weeks, if not months, to actually get medication. And I am so grateful to all the companies who have the patient assistance programs for people who do not have insurance. Those save lives.
Thank you. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with Megan. We also have a comprehensive lupus clinic. It still doesn't have all the parts that she indicated. So a couple of really important things I'll just sort of provide my agreement with. The adherence issue is a huge issue, and it isn't restricted to people of certain backgrounds. It's everybody. And I think that having new drugs that are less toxic and not as symptomatic or adverse events is really key. And I think these two drugs really do fit that bill. So that's one important issue, because I think we can get buy-in if patients don't feel terrible every time they're taking the drug. So that's one good thing. The second thing is exactly what Megan said. Depending on the insurance you have, and this is almost certainly part of healthcare disparity, depending on what you come in with, it can take forever to get a drug approved. And, a lot of my patients have Medicare or Medicaid, and getting some of these more expensive drugs approved is really difficult. And then that doesn't really exclude the private insurers, because they have their own routine of, Megan was being very generous. It takes me months sometimes to get a drug. And if that's the case, then I cannot not treat a patient for that length of time. So then I go back to something that is out there that I can get. My experience in clinic is a little bit different probably than the private practitioner, because I'm at an academic center, so I have fellows seeing patients, so I can actually sit down with the patient. And I think it's also important to sit down with the family member, because if you don't have support of your family members when you are taking these very potent drugs that cause you to do different things and behave differently, like steroids, you are not going to really be on board with it. And I can explain the various options at length because I can spend more time with people, and that is really not true in the private sector, right? It's very quick in and out. So I think, you know, and Megan is, I think, in a similar situation in an academic medical center, but we are atypical, I would say, and most people don't interact with us at the first visit. So I think that's a broader question of how do you practice medicine in this country that we're not going to fix in an hour and a half, but those are some of the things I think about.
Actually, let me jump to the payers for a second, because this feels like, well, actually, I'm sorry, before I leave the clinical experts on this point, I was going to ask this later anyway, but we usually ask folks, given your best understanding of the clinical landscape and the indications for these drugs, you know, what % of patients who qualify should be on one or the other? Is it 100% of the patients? Is there a good reason that only half the patients should be treated with one of these drugs or the other? You know, what should we turn around and look 2-3 years from now and see as far as the slice of the pie that's on one of these treatments, patients with active lupus nephritis?
Want to start, Brad?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure starting is an advantage here. You know, what I want to do is what everyone else wants to do, and I think Kathleen said the exact right word, which is precision medicine. I want to be able to tie a drug into a patient's pathogenesis of their lupus and lupus nephritis. Without having that present, then I just have to do my best at trying to figure out how best to use these medications. And so in my feeling is that we may see, I'm not going to say one or the other, we may see one of these medications become a fairly routine standard of care for initiation of therapy, and the other medication become a fairly routine standard of care long term. And we can debate which one is which later, but my guess is that we are going to gradually see most of our patients convert to these sort of regimens.
Okay.
Well,
Dr. Matthew, would you agree?
Yes, I definitely agree with that, and I think one will be more for induction in the first several months versus more long term. But I also think choice is really going to be guided by the potential toxicities of each one, even though they don't look so bad. I guess that goes without saying, but I'm also a little bit concerned. I don't want to jump the gun and say everybody 100%'s got to be on one or the other, because we still have 50-60% of patients not responding as complete responders, and we need them. We need to keep investigating, as Brad just said. We need to find the ways. We need other drugs that will perhaps be more effective in individual situations, so we can't close the door on the research.
Okay, got it. So actually, before I head to the payers for a comment on something, a couple of things that will come up, but from your guys' perspective, you know, when we looked we always try to get context partly by looking at clinical guidelines. And as you know, there are more recently updated European ones, but the American College of Rheumatology guidelines in this area from 2012, as far as we're aware. Payers often look to those clinical guidelines to help guide their thinking about coverage policies. Where are the clinical specialty societies on this? Are they lagging? Should we kind of give them a kick in the pants and give them a recommendation to get some new guidelines going in this area, or where does that stand?
I think I don't know what happened to the ACR. Megan, a couple years ago, they were trying to get the ACR group together to actually redo the ACR guidelines, and I was invited. I'm not a member of ACR, of course. I'm a nephrologist, but for the lupus nephritis part, but they were unable to do that because they felt everyone was too conflicted, because most of us who work with this, work with companies helping develop and test these drugs. I don't think that's truly a conflict. I think that gives us good insight. Most of us, I think, are very objective. To answer your question more specifically, because I do know this, because I was the chairperson of the committee, KDIGO, which is Kidney Disease Improving Global Outcomes Organization, its guideline of glomerular diseases will be coming out. It's being reviewed right now, and it has an entire section. In fact, the longest chapter is on lupus nephritis. Now, it talks about the new drugs, but we haven't had a full evidence review, which is done by the Cochrane Group, of all of the data yet. So it mentions the new drugs, but they're not in the recommendations yet because they can't be. The good news is that we're not waiting another decade before we do the guidelines. These will be updated on an annual or semi-annual basis. So once the first set is done, then we're going to start the evidence review of the VOCLO and the BLISS-LN trials and try to incorporate those as, because we want to do good evidence analysis. So that's coming, and it's coming a lot quicker than what had been in the past.
Good. I mean, it's an underappreciated point, I think, among many folks, that the degree to which payers do look for clinical guidelines, and they do, they obviously prefer those coming from the major societies, done in a way that feels relatively shielded from conflicts of interest. But especially with new treatments kind of shaking up the paradigm of care, it's very helpful for them to have the clinical specialty societies engaged.
And
one
Steve,
last question for you.
If I could just jump in briefly.
Oh, Linda, sure.
This is a great opportunity for us to really kind of think about guidelines. I think about screening mammography guidelines, for example. Real quickly, Black women get breast cancer much younger than white women, and about 25% of breast cancers occur under the age of 50, and yet the USPSTF has recommended raising the age to start looking for breast cancer to 50. Which means another 1,200 to 1,300 Black women would die every year from breast cancer after 5 years. So this is an opportunity to look at lupus nephritis, look at who's disproportionately impacted, call for the research that needs to happen, but then take into consideration exactly what we see in real world evidence into these guidelines, so that providers following guidelines don't inadvertently disadvantage or underserve their patients.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point. I mean, much as, many groups are trying to figure out how to reorient to make sure that they're thinking about health equity in a new way, and groups that meet to make clinical guidelines certainly seem ripe for that kind of consideration. It's not just about the evidence, if you will. Thank you. That's good. I also wanted to, I'm sorry, one more question for the clinical experts, because I know, Brad, that you had mentioned this in some earlier discussions, and payers will want to know. I'll just say it, the discussion around voclosporin working quicker would suggest that a clinician might want to say, I found you, you've got active lupus, let's start you on voclosporin and then transition you to belimumab after that, because we can't keep you on voclosporin for very long. Is that, and that will raise the question of, will there be some overlap? And an insurer will want to know, do I ever provide coverage for both drugs at the same time? Because the general instinct is to say, no, we don't do that, because there's certainly no evidence today of these two drugs being used at the same time. And therefore, the safer thing is to say no until we get some clinical experience out there. But what is your early advice to payers as they think about this question of dual use, sequential use, because they're going to need to think about this today?
So if I was able to talk to payers, and I know there's 2 or 3 on right now, I would say, just let me do what I want and provide the insurance, but that doesn't really fly. I am very excited about having both of these drugs approved, and it's no secret I work with Sim, and I've worked with Bernie. I think that I would use both drugs at once. I would start out therapy. This is an idealized situation that I'd love to investigate. with a voclosporin-based regimen. And because the belimumab kicks in later, I would want to start it relatively quickly as well. I would like to get the patient to go into remission as quickly as possible. One of my catchphrases is you know, time is nephrons, and nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. And as the disease, you know, continues, then we lose more and more of those units, and get the patient in remission quickly, and then keep the patient in remission with a drug like belimumab that really does seem to decrease flares of both renal and non-renal lupus. And I think both Sim and Bernie have heard me say that would be a really cool combined clinical trial for both of them to sponsor if they got together. But yeah, I think that payers, we're going to have those requests, and I think there's no data for sequential treatment, but I think I can give you a good scientific justification for combined treatment based on not just my own opinion, but actually the pathology and pathogenesis of lupus kidney disease, and that makes good sense. And that gets to sort of a bigger question of, there's a lot more drugs coming down the pike, and I'm going to guess that ICER is going to be having this conversation in another 2 years when some of these other clinical trials hit with other new therapies. The more therapies we have at our disposal for a diverse patient population where the disease is very heterogeneous, the more likely we are going to come up with combinations of these new drugs that are A, less toxic, and B, more personalized. And that's sort of my overarching goal.
All right. Let me pivot to the, I know Dr. Mack, you might want to jump in, but let me pivot to the payers just for a sec, because I think I'm conscious of the clock, and I know the number of things that are going to be interesting to talk about. So I would like to start to talk about coverage a little bit, but before we get too specific, Jay or Emily, you've seen this before, and I'll be more provocative in this case. So new treatments coming into an area that are going to change the paradigm. There are other treatments in the pipeline. You've heard a clinical expert who says, I want to have them all to be able to, view them as a palette from which I can paint a personalized approach to each patient. Some payers will have nightmares, I guess you could say, of certain areas of cancer treatment or others where it's completely anything goes. There seems to be no standards. The guidelines say basically choose anything you want and throw it in there, or there are very few drugs that are indicated for what's needed. And it ends up becoming very expensive and very hard to know whether evidence is supporting any of the practices that you're seeing. So I don't know if you think that way at all when you start to see new treatments coming in for lupus nephritis, but you're already hearing this question about dual use at launch for two drugs that have been approved within about 6 months or 8 months of each other by the FDA. So what's your conceptual approach to this? How will you and your P&T committees decide what to do with this question of dual use as our first question about how we're going to deal with coverage? Jay or Emily?
Yeah, hey Steve, it's Jay, and I'm happy to go first. Maybe just a couple of comments, general comments, if I might. And I would love to circle back to the sequential treatment that you just described. And if it's okay, I'd like to poke Dr. Roven's brain just a little bit more as well. One, I appreciate the fact that you started this conversation with health inequalities. So I want to make sure I state that. And then the other thing I like to maybe just state is I appreciate the fact that the CEPAC voted that they saw a high impact as it relates to for a lifetime impact in this particular disease state. Dr. Roven, if it's okay, I'm curious, should I interpret your comments to say that you're going to start a new patient on voclosporin first and then move to Benlysta? Is that how I should interpret those comments?
Megan and I are evidence-based people, so I wouldn't just willy-nilly do it. I'd do it in the context of a study. But what I would like to see is a study where we combine those two drugs, and because the belimumab takes a while to kick in because of its mechanism of action, I would probably start them not sequentially, but concurrently to really cost you guys a lot of money. And there's a reason for that, which we can or not discuss here, but that would be the trial I would like to see. Next. And with that, eliminating corticosteroids or incredibly decreasing corticosteroids, and maybe using MMF or cyclophosphamide, but in a limited way, and getting rid of it pretty quickly. So a complete different paradigm of what we have currently.
Got it. And I think, Steve, back to your question, it's about, I think that what causes us probably to pause just a little bit is, it sounds like that's evidence that we need to generate.
Correct. That's why I said trial. Yeah.
Yep.
So, and that creates, again, one of those interesting tensions that we see all the time. When new treatments emerge, it often creates an instant interest in generating that new evidence, while clinicians also are kind of very interested in using it clinically. So we have to figure out if we can put that all together. Emily, in terms of how it's looked at Premera, when you would come to do new drugs like this, where you might get a request from a clinical expert to use them concurrently, how are you going to manage that?
Yeah, Steve, I would say that in general, in this interim period when evidence is being generated, it's so important to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. And I think, this disease is a great example of how every patient is unique and should be treated as such. And, the way that you do prior authorization, I think there's a range in terms of how standardized you can be versus how unique you can be. And I think with these patients in this disease, peer-to-peer calls, I think are a really great resource in order to really understand each unique patient and their own unique needs, in addition to how this relates to combination use.
Does peer-to-peer mean a nephrologist to a nephrologist, or a doctor to a doctor, or what?
Depending on where the review is in the process, it can be a specialist peer to specialist peer for our organization, or it can be potentially a more general medical director.
Okay. I'm going to try to ask people to be as quick as possible, because we have a lot to.
All right. You get I talk too much. Okay, fine. Right. Very quickly. Peer-to-peer is a broken system. And if you and Jay can fix it, that would be great, because by the time I get to talk to a real human being, first I go through 10 letters that are taking a month to assess each. It's a year down the road. So I agree. Peer-to-peer is great, because once I can explain myself, they usually agree with me. Second, it would be nice to have a peer who's an expert in the field. Okay, because half the time on my peer-to-peers, I'm educating the person. They're general practitioners. Okay, number three, I'm going to cut you guys a break here. I don't think everybody out in the universe who practices nephrology or rheumatology should be prescribing these drugs. I think that when you get a request from a legitimate lupus center, an expert in lupus, that's the time to start thinking about approving these things, which actually pushes me to my next part, which would help the patients. I think if patients got funneled into lupus centers of excellence prior to, spending however many months many of the patients on the phone spent before getting diagnosed, that would be good too, and that would certainly improve health disparities.
I'm going to come back to the question of who can prescribe it, because that is part of the coverage policy. But I know, Megan, you've been waiting to jump in. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I think at this point in time, to do any kind of combination outside of a clinical trial would be a little dicey, and especially since all of these drugs were given on a background of mycophenolate or Cytoxan, so to give one or the other without that heavily immunosuppressive background, it's just, it's very, very individual, as Emily was saying. And I would love it if all patients could be funneled to lupus centers of excellence. I just don't. I mean, there aren't enough. There's patients that just can't get there. Yeah. So if we could figure out ways to do that, yeah.
We've had this happen before, where the recommendations for what really would be best for patients kind of meet each other at the back end, because we want broad access. We want it available to people in vulnerable communities, rural areas, not to be at, you know, kind of top centers where they can have multidisciplinary care, and you just can't make that work sometimes. But it's important to say that both should be in some sense a goal, but it is hard to do both. All right, we're going to get really into Kathleen's area of interest in particular, which is step therapy, as part of talking about something else that happens when payers sit down to try to take the evidence and create their coverage policy for a new treatment. They look at the FDA label, they look at the clinical trial eligibility and exclusion criteria, and they try to figure out what to do with that. Do they blend them? Do they not? And so I'm going to get into that. But I want to start with step therapy in specific, because that's a part of prior authorization in some cases. Now, Kathleen, I know that you've had experiences with some treatments that go back years, and so it's probably not relevant. Or maybe it is for the two drugs now. But just tell us, if you will, from the patient's perspective, what you think we ought to consider as far as recommendations or learnings about step therapy.
Well, first and foremost, somebody like me is so unique. It takes a whole treatment team, and I'm part of the treatment team, to work with me. And my rheumatologist says treating me is like balancing on a pinhead on his tippy toe. And I'm an outlier. Anything that will happen will happen. I am allergic to inactive ingredients and preservatives and drugs, and even eye drops, which has caused a whole multitude of issues with me. So it takes special care to treat me, and a lot of time, like Brad was saying. And it took me years to find my treatment team. My first step therapy story was in 2011 when belimumab was approved. And I'd like to put out the disclaimer that I was the patient rep at the FDA that voted to approve that drug. It was the first drug developed specifically for lupus after 56 years of no drugs whatsoever. We were so excited in the community, and people just wanted to line up to get this drug. And within several months, multiple insurance companies in over 30 states applied step therapy protocol to it. And none of us knew what that was. So my rheumatologist prescribed belimumab for me, and my private carrier applied step therapy to it. And I was appalled because I had taken 12 years to get from 20 milligrams of steroids to 10 in little baby steps of 0.5 milligram increments, because I kept flaring at 1 milligram. And remember, I weighed 220 pounds on 60 milligram at one point. And what the protocol demanded for us to fail the other drugs before we get belimumab would be to go back on 10 milligrams more of steroids if you were on 10, or to go back on it if you were off steroids. Plus, your treating physician had to do a SLEDAI, Systemic Lupus Erythematosus Disease Activity Index, which was only done in clinical trials. So rheumatologists who didn't know how to do it were kind of stymied. There was just no way that I was ever going to go back up on my steroids unless I was in a life-threatening situation. So I ended up not going on belimumab, and that was in 2011. To this day, it still has step therapy protocols. Not as strict as those, different ones. You still have to fail other treatments, and some treatments that you have to fail are not even approved for lupus, which boggles my mind. I believe that that these newer treatments, what good is it if they're developed and we fight to get patients in trials, we fight to get research done, and then they get approved, but then they sit on a shelf expiring because they can't make it to a patient. And it's onerous and restricted coverage, and we may actually, in the long run, be advancing the inequities that we're hoping to circumvent, especially across Medicare and Medicaid programs, which cover a large percentage of the overall USLN population. I believe it's an ethical dilemma too. I believe that my treating physician is educated and ethically obligated to treat the uniqueness of someone like me. And these payer utilization protocols push our treating providers into an ethical dilemma. Do they do what the payers want and potentially harm the patient? Or do they have to fight like hell and put in so much time in their staff time to try to get us the best treatment? So I believe ethics and empathy have to be part of the conversation to improve our healthcare system. Thank you.
All right, so let's go back, because we are going to talk now about the prior auth criteria, but that's a strong statement for around step therapy issues. We might as well just stay with step therapy for a second. I mean, Jay or Emily, when you think of these two drugs, and I know you've thought about them a little bit, and you already have coverage policies for belimumab, obviously. What does the role of step therapy play in your current coverage policy, and how do you think of implementing it to avoid some of the problems, certainly that Kathleen just mentioned? Is there step therapy for belimumab in your in terms of how you think it's being used for lupus nephritis, at least?
Yes, Steve, I can start. So for us, for belimumab, we require that the patient is receiving standard therapy, and that's defined as mycophenolate, cyclophosphamide, azathioprine, or another immunosuppressant, plus the corticosteroids. So previous use of combination of those products.
Right, and that general approach is kind of that's largely taken from the clinical trial criteria, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and so I'm going to kind of start to weave in those questions. Jay, anything you'd like to add about the way that you guys approach it, or respond to what Kathleen said?
No, I guess first, Kathleen, I'm sorry that you've had the experience that you've had related to step therapy in general. Steve, I think Emily's comments as it relates to current coverage is probably pretty standard across the industry today.
All right. So, I mean, the way that a lot of people think about step therapy, which is try another indicated treatment before you get this indicated treatment. We obviously don't have that right now for these two, unless someone said you have to try voclosporin first and then you can get belimumab. But I don't see that on the table at this point for any of the payers. But we'll keep that in mind. What I did want to highlight is I'm looking at it right now, and I know you don't have it, but the FDA label for these drugs are very simple. They're basically, indicated for adults with active lupus disease in combination with background immunosuppressive therapy. That's kind of all it says. And then if you go to the clinical trial criteria, you get all these interesting things that we can talk about, whether an insurer should say, yep, I need to have the doctor or somebody tick that box and that box because this adult patients with active lupus disease doesn't give a lot of specificity. Now, some people might argue that that's the way you want it. That allows the doctors to decide what active lupus disease means, which patients, etc. So there's always this tension between the kind of freedom, if you will, to interpret things as doctors and patients want to, and to a certain extent, what the evidence base is with patients who are in the trials. So I'll start with voclosporin. And I guess I could invite certainly Sim, if you want to jump in at some point on this, you're welcome to. But I was going to kind of work between the payers and the clinical experts a bit. The first point is that the trials included patients who'd had a kidney biopsy showing active, class 3, 4, or 5 lupus nephritis. I don't know if every insurer does or doesn't require a kidney biopsy, but forgive me if that's just kind of completely standard practice for a nephrologist or a rheumatologist before you would start a patient on one of these treatments. Let me start with the clinical experts. Would they all have a kidney biopsy before this would even be considered?
Well, that's definitely preferable, but it is not always the case. There are many, many times where you just, well, Brad's a nephrologist, so I'm sure 100% of his are, but for me, it's often difficult to actually get the biopsy done. And there are a fair number of patients who don't want it. And I don't think we should be in any way restricting them from availability to these medications. So I don't think biopsy should be a requirement for using this medication, either one of them.
Brad, what do you think?
Well, eventually almost every LN patient will have a biopsy to confirm or the diagnosis or to understand, what the disease of kidney looks like. All of my patients have a biopsy, and often they have more than one biopsy. Megan is right. Sometimes it's hard to get and sometimes the patients don't want it, but they usually do if you can provide a rationale. for why you're doing it. So I don't think you need a biopsy every time you want to use belimumab or voclosporin. I think that once you know what the disease is and the patient flares, it may be nice to have a biopsy, and we certainly are providing literature that it's important to do that. But you know, if a person has class 4 lupus and they flare, clinically they have class 4 lupus, you can start treatment. So I don't think that would be restrictive, and I wouldn't interpret that as being restrictive. I don't know what the insurers would say.
Could I just add a comment or two there, Steve,
Tim,
based on sort of,
based
on sort of what we've heard from clinicians and our experience in our clinical trials. First of all, within our clinical trial program, we allowed biopsies up to 2 years. And part of the reason for that, although our preference initially was to do it within 6 months, was really pushback from US clinicians saying, listen, you know, your 6-month criteria may be fine for the FDA, but clinically it doesn't make any sense because we have patients who have lupus. They've had lupus nephritis before. We have a biopsy on file from a few years ago, and that patient is not going to go back to get another biopsy done. So it was a reasonable pushback from them. So we extended specifically the Aurora trial because we had 60 US sites to a 2-year criteria. I think some of what you know you're hearing from some of our clinicians is, you know, if it's got hooves and it has stripes, then you know it's probably a zebra, right? And if you have somebody who has lupus and they've had lupus nephritis documented before years ago, and they have a similar pattern again with proteinuria coming back, that's really where we run into trouble trying to get that patient to get a biopsy. And I think that that's a situation where if payers just blanket put in a biopsy criteria, we're going to hurt that patient physician situation of somebody who's had LN before, they've had lupus documented, they have a biopsy on file from years before, and now we're going to force them to go back and get another biopsy. Because frankly, although that may be what happens with centers of excellence, such as where Brad works in, that's not our experience with most of the clinicians in the US today.
Steve,
sure,
if I
Brian,
might.
go ahead. Brian, go ahead.
So our criteria was a biopsy within 6 months of randomization in the clinical trial. And although it was an international trial, we were able to achieve that. And it's the largest study in lupus nephritis that's been published thus far.
Payers, any reactions to this question? Will this come up in your formulary thinking? I'm sure I'm not sure. Actually, I didn't look at that specific issue in your current coverage for belimumab, but with voclosporin pending, any thoughts on how you're going to deal with the question of kidney biopsy and how others should?
Yes, see, for us, we utilize the guidelines and their definition of how to diagnose for this disease. And so, you know, I would say that within a medical policy, there's always room between the lines. And so, you know, all of our reviewers look at it on a case-by-case basis for each patient. And if, you know, if it's not exactly what is stated in the guidelines, because as you mentioned, the ACR guidelines are outdated, you know, that is taken into consideration with every review. Okay.
Jay, anything you want to add?
I would say biopsies in general come up in our P&T discussions, and not necessarily specifically for this one. It will be interesting to see if it comes back up again as we review leucosporin as well.
You know that our guidelines, you know, suggest diagnosis with a biopsy and then using repeat biopsies when important or necessary, but they don't require a biopsy every time a patient has a flare.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And they're recommended at diagnosis, but they're not required.
Correct.
I think the question is going to be kind of, I think that some of the debate we just had here, is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it a 2 year? Or do we allow the physician to attest that there's been a biopsy?
Yeah. That is the classic question that, yeah, a lot of formulary people will come up to, which is, do you need documentation? And if so, what time frame? And physician attestation is another option that they will be weighing. Let me move from that question to whether there's going to be a need to document the proteinuria, which is also kind of linked to the eligibility criteria for the studies. Is that just superfluous to ask a doctor to submit that information, or should it be attested? Let me ask the clinical experts. Any thoughts on whether an insurance policy coverage criteria that required documentation of the UPCR greater than 1.5, is that reasonable?
I think documentation of proteinuria is as important or more important even than the biopsy, and I would go with somewhere around 1, not as high as 1.5 necessarily, because that's really to date our best indicator, certainly of long-term outcomes, is proteinuria.
Yeah, I don't, every patient will have a proteinuria value, so providing that is not going to be a big deal. Okay, there is nobody managing lupus nephritis that doesn't check a patient's proteinuria, I hope, and certainly not in my experience. What the right level is debatable, and I'd rather not pick a number per se. I like to look at trajectories. We all know that we have patients with low levels of proteinuria that, when on biopsy, have very severe disease. So, you know, it's okay to pick these apart in this discussion, but in the end, when we make a recommendation or consideration of treatment, we put the whole picture together: biopsy, urinalysis, proteinuria, serum creatinine, et cetera, et cetera.
Serology.
Yeah.
I think you would, it'd be interesting. Everybody feels like they should walk in their shoes. It is interesting to think of how you would experience if you spent time watching a P&T committee doing what it did, and they spent time watching what you did. It would be a very interesting out-of-body experience. Let me move forward quickly, because there's one more big piece of this that I wanted to cover, which is the EGFR cutoffs for exclusion criteria. So as important as inclusion, sometimes insurance coverage criteria will exclude from coverage based on the same exclusion criteria based in the studies. Here we've got EGFR for voclosporin less than 45 is in the label, although it was less than 50 as the exclusion criteria in Aurora. So I'm not sure what went on there, 50 and 45. And the EGFR is less than 30 as a cutoff in the trial criteria for BLISS-LN. So bottom line is, should insurers say if you have an EGFR below X, you shouldn't have coverage for these?
I feel very strongly about this. Absolutely not. There's a lot of situations where the EGFR is low because the patient has acute kidney injury because their disease is so severe. And you know, I understand why we run trials the way we run them. And I think Sim and Bernie know I argue against a lot of things that are done. But I have plenty of patients that come in with severe lupus nephritis that have a low EGFR that do just great when you treat them, and their GFR comes back to normal. What you need to take into consideration is what you are interpreting with the GFR, and that can be acute kidney injury, okay, because of inflammation, et cetera, or it can be chronic disease that's a scar that's never going to get better. Now, what does that mean? That means until we have something better than histology, you've got to go back to the biopsy to decide what to do. And in fact, my group is very aggressive with biopsies when we are worried about chronic versus acute disease. I don't think the patients like having multiple biopsies. You've got patients on board here, you can ask them. But my average in my clinic is 2 to 3 biopsies per patient over the course of lupus nephritis. We are trying very hard, and I must say we're now finally making progress to find biomarkers that would allow us to assess the condition of the kidney non-invasively. And I think in the next, I don't know, Megan, I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say in the next 5 years, we're going to have a couple of qualified biopsies, qualified biomarkers that are going to help us with this. I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, it's a little optimistic, but I think there's really good potential. And I will back you up there, Brad, that that is the one situation that you can pretty much get a biopsy done on almost anyone is in that situation where the EGFR is very low and you don't know how much chronicity is going on in the kidney versus activity. And wouldn't be unreasonable for a determination of a payer, I think, to say, well, your creatinine is, your EGFR is 30. I need a biopsy before I'll approve it.
Well, the other,
Brad, let me jump forward because
okay.
I know you're going to want me to get through a couple of other points too. But I mean, when the FDA has it in the label, you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that you'll see it in an insurance coverage criterion. And as you said, there may be reasons to work with clinicians in a peer-to-peer way, most likely to deal with what the options would be for a patient. Because the FDA's language is you shouldn't do it unless the benefit exceeds the risk, which of course is, I think the FDA every once in a while maybe likes to stir up trouble. That kind of language is going to stir up trouble between clinicians and insurers. Let me move to the key issue of whether insurers should do something at 6 months for voclosporin. Because again, in the FDA label, consider discontinuation if the patient has not experienced therapeutic benefit at 24 weeks. Insurers, am I right that you're likely to include a criterion that says at 24 weeks, I want to see attestation or something else, or that should be it? Or are you going to let the clinician decide what to do at 24 weeks?
Yeah, Steve, I think it's a fair point. I think that will be heavily debated inside of our P&T committee, and it is likely that we'll put some criteria in place.
Emily, what do you think?
I think for us, Steve, we usually give it a little bit more time, just in general, if there's, a requirement in a certain time frame, because not every patient's going to go in exactly 6 months for evaluation, and so. This is still being discussed, but I think, our standard is a year, and that's just due to the realities of life in terms of, getting care at the right time.
And the way insurance coverage policy works, you're likely to say you get coverage for 6 months and then you have to come back to get it again. It's not like just keeps going. I mean, whatever the time frame is. Am I right to expect that that's likely to be the case here for voclosporin?
I think potentially. I think that's the, reauth criteria. And I don't think it will be a hard 6 months, right? I think we would allow for, the patient to see benefit, also allow for them to be checked by their physician as well.
Okay. Boy, I'm moving fast here, but the rheumatologist versus nephrologist question that Brad raised earlier, Brad, I think I can quote you. Only nephrologists should be prescribing this. Did I hear you correctly? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
No, I don't think I said that. I think you're putting words in my mouth.
No. But you said I'm going to make your day, insurers, or something to that effect. But
I said a lupus clinic. A lupus clinic.
All right. I think I wanted to hear more precision around the idea of how do we maximize the benefits for patients? Do we maximize the benefits for patients by putting any restrictions on provider qualifications? And if so, what would they be?
I think that's a really hard question. Our lupus clinic, I keep saying our lupus clinic is a combination of nephrologists and rheumatologists that see patients together in the same clinic on the same day. To me, that is maximizing patient care as good as it gets. You've got the people that are most major organ systems are being taken care of. I don't have anything to offer on this. Obviously, I respect and have a lot of friends who are rheumatologists who are excellent in lupus nephritis, and Megan and I wrote a paper on this together. So, and I mean, she's in New York, I'm in Ohio, but the point is that what you had said earlier was, in part of this conversation was, or the idea was, could we get patients into specialized lupus clinics? And the answer was sort of, well, maybe not, because there's not a lot of access to healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because I think if COVID has taught us anything positive that's come out of this, is that we can do a lot of stuff by telehealth. And if we partner with a patient's local physician, rheumatologist or nephrologist, which is what we're starting to do in our community, we may be able to bring our expertise to places that would not normally have access to it. So I would venture to say that we need to start to think outside the box a little bit. I hate that phrase, but I'm using it. And I'm going to throw this at the insurers. I get a lot of pushback about doing telemedicine now for patients not residing in the state of Ohio. They have to cross the border to listen to me on telemedicine, and that restriction is kind of goofy. And I don't think that's your restriction. I actually think that's the state boards of health. But
Right.
I think if we tried to fix things like that, Megan's center could provide stuff for the Eastern Seaboard. My center could provide stuff for the Midwest, et cetera, et cetera. And that would be really cool for patients.
One of the things that we may note, Jay, go ahead.
No, I would echo the comments. I think we do support telehealth, so I think we can get behind that as well.
I would agree 100%. I was thinking about this, and I think it would also, and I have done this, is also just partner not even with another rheumatologist somewhere, but a general practitioner to act as a remote consultant. That's fine too. I don't think it has to be restricted just to rheumatology or nephrology, as long as there is one consulting.
Yeah, agree. But okay. One of the patients has a question.
Let me go on and let Christelle jump in.
Yeah.
We've got about 10-ish minutes left, and I want to turn to issues of pricing and still a broader question about coverage. So we're into the home stretch. It's going to be a bit of a sprint, but I wanted to make sure Christelle had a chance to make her comment.
I was going to say I'm really glad that Brad mentioned the issue of telehealth and maybe partnering with different clinics, because when he mentioned earlier about the idea of bringing patients to lupus centers or like specialized centers, I really like that idea, in an ideal world, but in reality, like I go to a lupus center, but I take 3 to 4 buses there, and Kathleen drives how many hours there, and we're able to do that because we either do not work or we work, part-time or something like that, and it's not very realistic for a lot of people, especially depending on where they live, and people who work full-time or who raise kids, etc. But I like the idea of the telehealth for one, and partnering specialized centers with general practitioners or something like that.
Great. Yeah, actually insurers often do have ways to weave that into their coverage language so that they can try to make sure that prescribing doctors are able to be in consultation with the kinds of experts that we're benefiting from today. All right, I'm going to make one comment.
I know you have to move on, but let me just say one thing that's important. We have some early evidence that telehealth can actually improve healthcare because providers can see into the homes of their patients and get a better understanding of what their lived experiences are. And we're hearing that they're actually being less judgmental about compliance and adherence and other issues, these things we call the social determinants of health.
That's a good point. Thanks, Lynn. That's a good point. Who's done telehealth here among all of you in the past year? Any of you? I have. It was interesting, wasn't it? Yeah, look at that. Yeah. Did you check what was behind you before you talked to the doctor? Yeah.
Or who's walking behind you.
I think that's what improves social. No, I'm not going to make that joke. No, it's a very powerful tool that we're all it was there in the ether, and all of a sudden it's now all of us raised our hand. It's really interesting. Okay, one comment in a way that will invite a response, and then I want to shift to pricing and other issues, related issues. So for those of you who know kind of ICER's general structure and thinking about the way that fair pricing and fair access should fit together, we saw in the meeting today that the cost effectiveness and the overall value is judged by CEPAC basically suggested that the pricing was aligned with the added benefit to patients, with all of the uncertainty that we've still got about these treatments notwithstanding. And that would suggest that in general, when insurers come to the table to think about coverage, that they not look for every last nook and cranny of the clinical eligibility criteria to try to narrow the scale of coverage. And in a sense that if responsible pricing that aligns with the benefit is there, that the coverage can be, if you will, a little bit, I won't say looser, but I will say will create greater degrees of freedom for use for doctors and patients. And yet, And Wall Street analysts said that if only 25% of the eligible patients are treated, it's $1 billion a year with essentially either of these drugs. And so the payers, part of their job is to think about that too. This is still going to be potentially a lot of money, and people are going to be wanting them to be careful and to use the evidence to kind of guide appropriate coverage. Emily and Jay, Bill, any comment in general you'd like to make about the way that you want others to know how your organizations think about if the pricing seems fair and seems aligned with the added benefits? Does it lead to any change to the way that you think about how you devise your prior authorization, the way you implement it, the way you think in any way about the coverage of the treatments? Emily, what would you say?
If I say it definitely would. You know, I think I do want to call it that, you know, correct, and folks on this call can keep me honest, but the annual cost of voclosporin can vary quite a bit with the dose reductions based on eGFR. So, you know, for me, I'm really interested to see how and when dose reductions will occur in real life and really impact the annual price for voclosporin.
Okay. Jay, what would you say?
I would maybe take a slightly different slant to the question, I guess, Steve.
Sure.
I think our P&T committee, the intent of the committee is to uphold the clinical integrity of our formulary coverage as well as our clinical policies. And we're going to follow the evidence. We are definitely mindful of the cost, and we have other committees that are mindful of the cost. But the P&T committee itself is charged with the clinical integrity of the formulary and the coverage criteria. We just want to make sure we follow the evidence and do the right thing by the patient.
Given if the pricing is viewed as fair, would that lead to a consideration around a lower tier, lower out-of-pocket tier within your formulary? Or again, does that have no role? Is it just the sticker price of the drug puts it in X tier?
No, I think that the cost effectiveness, and maybe that's where you're going, could definitely dictate the formulary tiering. But we start with coverage as it relates to on formulary or off formulary as it relates to an unmet need, and then the evidence, the body of evidence around it as well.
All right, so let me pivot over, and I'll just put a plug in for the idea that patients are eager to see that if pricing aligns fairly with the benefit, that they see a benefit out of that too, in terms of their out-of-pocket requirements, as well as the difficulties of working through prior auth, et cetera. So let's talk about the pricing a little bit. So again, the pricing was in the kind of zone, if you will, the cost effectiveness zone. It still may raise some questions about affordability given the number of patients who could potentially be treated. And for voclosporin, which was the more recent treatment, and Sim, I'm putting you on a difficult spot, but as you know, the reports when the price was named said Wall Street was surprised because it was a lot more than they were expecting. But you guys said, well, actually, if you look at the reductions in dose, the net return back to the company after expected rebates and the real world adherence is going to make the effective price to the payer much lower. And yet, you know, some people were still worried that the pricing was going to lead to more barriers to care than they expected. What's your experience in thinking about how the pricing is going to affect patients' ability to access this drug?
Yeah, well, we certainly hope it doesn't. You know, obviously, you know, that's our stand. The bottom line here is that we're dealing with a disease that has huge unmet need, but very objective endpoints. And I think that's a piece that has to be recognized. And there was a bit of conversation on this earlier around proteinuria. And all I'll say here briefly is there's at least 8 papers that support this highly objective lab result as the single best indicator of long-term outcome for people with lupus nephritis. So we knew when we looked at our data set that what we have is an enormous impact, and it truly is marked. If you take a look at these clinical trial results, and by the way, they're consistent, 2 pivotals, all the good stuff that you would want on a highly objective endpoint that's very meaningful long-term. So we knew that we had a home run in terms of efficacy overall. And then we had to balance that, however, against something else, which we also knew, that this is not a product that's going to have multi-year utilization. It doesn't treat lupus. It doesn't treat sort of the chronic condition that the patient has, but it is something that's going to be used for purpose. And because of some of the longer term issues around the class of drugs, we had a very good sense talking to clinicians that they're going to use it up front in those patients who have high proteinuria and relatively preserved eGFRs. They're going to expect to see a result very quickly. And if they don't see it, it's going to be off. And then they're going to use it for a year and a half in responders and move on to something else. So we had to take all of that into consideration when we came up with pricing of the drug. So we know, and again, I've been in this company for a few years now, and we were well aware along the way that we had to do a lot of work to come up with the pricing that we got to. It may not have been how we were thinking about this compound years ago before we saw the Aurora results, and before we had a lot of conversations with clinicians who really informed us how they were going to use this product in the first place. Mm-hmm. So we have the price we have, and then on the back end, what are we doing? Well, we're doing everything we can do as a manufacturer to try to support patient access, right? So we have our internal patient services departments and programs, which was a really heavy lift for a company that doesn't have any other approved products to rely on. But we built it internally, and clearly within whatever legal framework we're allowed to operate under, an ethical framework we're allowed to operate under, we have all the standard patient assistance programs, bridge programs, referrals to third parties that, we've made sort of completely non-committed, we've given grants to sort of third parties that can support people who don't have coverage in other ways. So we've done all the things that we can do on the back end to try to support those patients who, perhaps don't have the resources or insurance coverage to get the product. But we feel that the pricing that we delivered reflects sort of the efficacy that we've seen and also the way that we think physicians are going to utilize the product.
All right, we don't have time to talk about some of the questions that are raised about the contributions that go to patient assistance companies and whether that ends up helping the patients who need it most. There's some data that suggests that it doesn't, but I don't want to, in a sense, get too deep into that. Bernie, did you want to say anything at all about the way that, again, the price we were talking about for belimumab and its effectiveness was for the lupus nephritis part of its effectiveness, not for the broader effectiveness. So in a sense, you got extra credit for that implicitly. But any comments around how you see the pricing and its effect on access and recommendations for how responsible pricing should be considered in terms of the coverage?
Steve, I'll be mindful of the time and everything, and I appreciate being a part of this entire day. It's been very informative for me. I would say GSK has a strong track record of reasonably pricing our medicines. We're actively involved in creating solutions to help our patients have access to the medicines, and we have a copay program which helps eligible patients with their copay, and I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks. Sim, can I just come back on one thing though, that and this may seem unfair, but it came out, when you got your label and you were able to get the dosing as part, the treatment protocol became part of your patent. And by doing that, you extended the patent life out till 2037, so an additional, I forget, it was about 10 years extra, which certainly helped Wall Street think highly of your stock. But it's going to mean that patients and the rest of the system are going to have to not have an opportunity at a generic version of the treatment for a lot longer. And your CEO, when asked about this, said, "We know who we serve. We are public company executives, so whatever drives the best value for shareholders is where we're going." Sounds a little. You can say it's real world, but how would you look at the patient community that's trying to make sure that health inequity is advanced and that we can get to, at some point, a lower cost version of this, when the company executives are saying we're going to do everything to push the patent life out as far as possible?
Yeah, so we had about a 7-year composition of matter patent, Steve, on this product, and the reason for that is, you know, voclosporin has a really long development history through 2 companies and I think 3 previous indications. So there wasn't a lot of room left on that composition of matter patent. If you really think about it, all of the money and the resources that have been spent on bringing this product to market in the last 15 years are enormous. And I can't put myself in the head of Peter, and I have to admit that I did not read that quote myself in terms, so I can't verify to the I'm sure you're being accurate, but I didn't read it myself. I don't know what was in his head when he said that. But what I know, again, from somebody who is on the management team and is exposed to a lot of conversations, is the pricing and the method of use patent and the way we got to it are really the bare essential to get a return on all the investment that has been made on this one compound and this 2 companies that have been formed around it over probably the last better part of the decade plus. I personally, and again, it's, to me, a piece of it is the price of innovation. That method of use patent and the way the drug is dosed is truly unique. In retrospect, it may seem obvious, but to many clinicians who work with calcineurin inhibitors and are dealing with peaks and troughs with no real idea of what that peak and trough is doing to a patient, that simple idea of saying, look, let's take a look at the EGFR, it gives us an idea of how sensitive that unique patient is to calcineurin inhibition and then dose accordingly. To me, that is there should be a reward for that piece. So I'm comfortable with it. I'm perhaps not so comfortable with how it was voiced in public, but I think voiced in a clinical framework, it makes sense to me, especially when I look back on the last really 12 plus years of development of this compound.
My only concern is that if it becomes a trend for companies to look for dosing algorithms as a part of their intellectual property, it's a slippery slope to every single company coming up with a way to make that a part of their patent life, and that will just make, again, the affordability over the long haul that much more difficult. But I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying.
Can I just one minor thing? You have, hand on heart, that was not the way that this was brought forward. So in other words, this was not a tool that was said, we're going to take this sort of smart way of getting a patent extension. This was genuinely put into the protocol as the best way of using the drug for these patients. And it was a later decision going back and looking at it and say, wait, this is actually an innovation. So I just want to make sure that at least is clear.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so thank you guys. I have let us run a little bit over time, but that's okay. We always wrap up our policy roundtables, first off, by my thanking you guys, because this was extraordinary. But I'd also like to offer each of you the chance to have a final kind of closing statement. But we always keep it to a very short single sentence. So think maybe a comma can be thrown in there somewhere. But if you can, and it can be either the one key theme you want, CEPAC and the report to remember coming out of this. It can be a request of another stakeholder at the table, if you will, and something that you would want them to do to make the world a better place, 5-10 years from now. So it can be anything at all along those lines. But we're going to go around and let the patients have the last word. So I might start with the clinical experts. And Megan, can I ask you for anything you'd like to say as a final closing statement?
Well, a big thank you for including me, because it really has been an extraordinary experience. And I'm thrilled to have 2 new medications that we can use for our patients. We haven't talked about where to go forward in research and all, but there's a long way to go. And my request, I think that's most important to me, of Linda and her foundation and the patients, is really to keep partnering to deal with these health disparities. I think they're really holding us back in a big way. And if we can figure out better ways to move forward. That's my request.
Thank you, Megan. Brad.
This has been a unique experience for me. I've not done it before, and I really learned a lot. So thank you for including me. And I totally agree with what Megan said. Now I'll just bring in our pharma representatives and say also, please keep developing outstanding drugs so that we actually have work to do to help the patients further.
Great, thank you. Bernie, can I go to you next?
Well, I again appreciate the opportunity. You know, GSK has been invested in the lupus community now for well over a decade. I appreciate hearing from all of the patients who have been here today. We all recognize the challenges in doing trials that involve patients who suffer from lupus, and we look forward to continuing the battle to make sure that we have effective therapies like belimumab available in the future.
Thanks again. Simrat?
So from me and the working team at Aurinia, sincere thanks to ICER and the consultants you brought on board from Sheffield and other places as well, in terms of this sort of very collaborative approach that we've had over the last several months. I think you really listened to what we had to say, and we thank you for that. And for everybody else and the payers in particular, you know, let's just keep the focus on the patients.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Emily?
I just wanted to echo everyone and say thank you so much for the opportunity. Especially want to thank the patients and the patient advocates. Really enjoyed hearing the stories and the experiences today. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Jay?
Yeah, Steve, thanks to ICER for putting this on today. You know, thanks for the patients sharing their advocacy and their stories. I really did appreciate listening to the clinical experts this afternoon, and of course, to the drug manufacturers. We appreciate the innovation, and we would encourage the continued innovation and the reasonable pricing for that innovation as well.
Thank you very much. You know, the patients, one of the most enjoyable parts of these meetings, and in some ways the whole 8 months, is that we get to think of these folks who are patient advocates or patients as, you know, people. It's like, you know, people with lupus or just plain out people. So it's a real pleasure, and you guys brought all of that with you to the table today. So I'd love to hear your final thoughts. And Christelle, may I start with you?
I want to thank ICER for having me on board as a patient expert. And I also just want to thank the clinicians for advocating alongside us. It's really great to see that.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Linda?
So I too want to add my thanks, and just one note, effective technologies, as my epidemiologist colleagues will always say, are always disparities producing, because people with resources have access to the prescribing doctors, to money to just pay for it, or have better insurance plans. So let's just make sure that we're always keeping in mind those folks who are disproportionately impacted, but also tend to be left out of these conversations. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much. And Kathleen?
I echo thank you, and I had thanked you previously. This is from my heart, Steve, and for your whole team. I hope sincerely that LADA's engagement in this review, since its inception 8 months ago as a patient-led organization run by people with actual lupus, has demonstrated that although we are sick and some of us are disabled, that we still have tremendous value, and we don't want to be burdened or be sick to our families, employers, the healthcare system, or society. We want to be healthy and productive. And thank you for engaging us.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. So on behalf of the entire CEPAC, I really would like to applaud you guys and your contributions today, because as you know, the evidence is important and the report is helpful, but the contributions that you guys bring to the discussion and the ways that we can think about what it's going to mean and for the future of innovation and of kind of coverage and pricing, it's all really helpful. So thanks again. And we're going, if you want, please stay. If you need to leave, I understand, but we're going to turn back to the CEPAC. And I'm going to, actually, I think I'll let Jason, the chair, Jason, if you want, you can, kind of watch, just go through folks and let them offer their final thoughts, and then I'll wrap up right at the end. So Jason,
Steve,
back over to you.
Steve, thank you so much. So I think consistent with what I'd done earlier today, just sort of to address the Zoom, I'm going to go through alphabetical order so we don't miss anyone. So I'd like to start with Rob Azeltine. Maybe we'll come back to Rob. Kelly Buckland.
I think Kelly had to, actually, he was the one, he was number 13. He was unlucky number 13 who had to drop off earlier. So you can go to the next one.
Got it. Dr. Rena Conti.
Never first. Thank you all so much. This has been a very edifying day. I've certainly learned a lot about this condition, also these treatments. I also have learned a little bit more about the CEPAC efforts, and specifically, I think it behooves us all as practitioners in the field of health economics to think harder about how new medical technologies can really create disparities, and how our methods might not particularly value disparities as an objective to ameliorate or to improve. So I think this is an incredibly important discussion, and I hope that this moves our methods forward as well.
Thank you so much. Megan Golden.
Thank you. I echo the thanks for a great day. I think coming from working with the disease that has no effective treatments, I really appreciate the value of kind of new therapies that can really make a difference and the innovation behind them. And I also just want to comment that I really appreciated the role of the patients and the patient organizations in this meeting. It was a really great combination of people sharing their individual stories, and as well as addressing the policy issues. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Rebecca Kirsch.
Thank you. It was a very powerful day, particularly the patient and caregiver perspectives on their lived experience. And I think there was really great work done here today, in particular, thinking about the needs that patients have and their priorities, and the perspective that ICER has now prioritized. It's not just a nice to have anymore, those other considerations. Now it's a must have. And I think the patient and caregiver advocacy community is very encouraged by that. I know I am.
Thank you. Dr. Steve Kogan.
Well, first, thanks to Christelle and Kathleen and the others who shared such a compelling picture of the devastating impact of this disease. Thanks for educating me and others about that. I'd say I do worry we've gotten to the point where every new drug that provides some degree of clinical benefit is going to have a six-figure price tag. And I mean, I understand that the pricing, kind of gets us into a value assessment of voclosporin in particular that comes in right at the max of what ICER considers to be cost effective, and we talked about that. And I don't know, it occurs to me maybe rather than deem drugs in this value range as cost effective per se, ICER might consider them as maybe subject to available resources and local systems of care or something like that. So maybe just something to think about for the future. And I worry too about the pricing of voclosporin and its potential to exacerbate disparities pertaining to race and ethnicity in this condition. So, but overall, what a great session, and thanks. Hats off to ICER and to all that participated.
Thank you. Dr. Greg Lowe.
Thanks for all the participants. What I was really struck by, I think a lot has been covered, is that good providers are going to trial these drugs and then switch people off them, and maybe providers that aren't as well-resourced, capable, knowledgeable, something may be slower to do so, and insurers who aren't very capable may have bad step therapy, and maybe insurers who are better are going to recognize prior therapies failed. So I'm worried in the context of disparities that we're relying on a lot of things to work well, and when there are disparities involved, sometimes those things don't work well. So I think there's a lot of potential here for good systems to work well, and there's a lot of devil in the details here if things aren't run well. So thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Rob Azeltine.
Just want to say thank you. Very well organized, informative meeting. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate.
Dr. Lefterios Melanakis.
Well, thank you for the great session. Every time those sessions, I learn a lot. In this particular session, the role of the patient accounts was particularly powerful because it helped us think of the ramifications that cannot be captured by cost analysis. Also, the success of these agents will depend on the broad adaptation of those treatments by all who would benefit, and especially when there is such a race inequality in healthcare. I worry, and we should be monitoring the adaptation of those agents by all the categories who can benefit from these treatments the most. Thank you all. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Stephanie Nichols.
Thank you to everyone, as has already been stated, but in particular, thank you to our patients who shared your really, really powerful stories. Many of those stories really touched me personally. As I listened to today and learned so much from all of you, one of the things that I kept thinking about is, what is the role of trauma, generational trauma, and adverse childhood experiences, particularly in the development of lupus? And I wonder about how that influences our healthcare disparities in this disease in particular. Thank you all again.
Dr. Jean Ryer.
Thank you, Stephanie. I was having a similar thought, and I thank you for voicing it. Great presenters, all of you, and especially deep thanks to all of the people who brought a patient voice to this. It made a huge difference. To our colleagues who do trials and in pharma, please more diversity in these patients in trials, and please more patient-reported outcomes. Those were lacking here. We had mentioned that Latinx community has greater prevalence, but then we never heard that word again in the further discussion, and I really found myself wanting to know more about that. It wouldn't be a CEPAC meeting if I didn't say I'm very concerned about the pricing. I am very concerned about the pricing. To our friends in the lupus centers and the lupus community, I would suggest you look at the ECHO model to spread the knowledge of how to treat patients with lupus to those who can't get to you and need to be treated more locally. So take a look at that. I think you'll find some impressive evidence. And then finally, the health inequalities in this condition are staggering. I can't imagine, and I am a little angry at this point, that we would have been having some of the discussions that we had. I mean, we have had CEPAC meetings with conditions that affected far fewer and far less impacted communities than this, and I am still dumbfounded by some of our conclusions. I am glad we came out in a good spot, but I see great benefit to these treatments, and I am grateful. I want to see people be able to get them.
Thank you. Dr. Jason Schwartz.
Oops, you're on mute.
I think
Jason,
you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. So yes, I wanted to thank everyone as well. Colleagues have covered, I think, the points that were on my mind as well. I'm grateful to be part of this work, to hear from our patients and the moving stories that they've shared, and grateful for the manufacturers. I think our conversations are enriched by their engagement, not just at the virtual table today, but I think throughout ICER's work. And I think that's to their credit to be able to hear from and learn from the manufacturers as well of these products. I did note, as Jean mentioned as well, that at one point around patient relevant outcomes, we had heard the ICER team had heard so much about the importance of fatigue and quality of life as a really significant factor in their disease course. And I wish we had the kinds of results for these trials that would help add that level to the story as well. So I note that as one of these things we can continue to learn from going forward, and how the evidence is generated. But otherwise, my gratitude for a really amazing and informative day.
Thank you, and I guess I'll end by myself in saying that I've been involved with ICER for about 6 years now, and I've sort of come to sort of expect what we've seen today, which is this tremendous rigor with the comparative effectiveness evidence, with the decision analytic and economic modeling, and with integrating the patient perspective. And I think one thing I'll say about today that I felt very strongly, it was quite clear from today's session that retroactively that the patient perspective really tremendously influenced the decisions in the modeling and the way that the comparative effectiveness evidence was interpreted in an incredibly synergistic way. I'm fortunate to meet many of those patients and patient advocates today. I can see why the perspective has been so powerful, but not only powerful, extraordinarily pertinent. Some of the things that we heard today about disparities and some of the things we heard about childbearing and the lifetime burden of illness were directly relevant to the way that the modeling was done, the way that we voted, the way that the deliberation occurred. So this is incredible synergy that I thought was very, very good for enriching our discussion and voting today. So thank you.
Jason, thank you. Thank you to you. This was your first meeting as chair of the New England CEPAC. I think you passed with flying colors. Did a great job, as did you all. And heck, I've got 5 minutes. I may actually use it. We're back on time somehow. Thank you. First, I would actually like to thank the research team, including our colleagues at Sheffield. And when I say team, I also include the patient advocates and the manufacturers who contributed all the way through, because it was a really rich process and it was a combined effort, obviously. But we did benefit so much from the input of those folks from the very first day, helping us see what we didn't know, and really helping us ask the right questions, even when the evidence wasn't there. It included interesting time points at which there was a deep interest in trying to figure out whether there was a differential effectiveness across different racial or ethnic groups. And then when we would go to look at the evidence, it was clear that, it was really hard and murky, and concerns about whether we might say something that would be misinterpreted. And it's just a journey we're all going to be on, which is how do we try to look at evidence but not overinterpret it or send the wrong kind of signals about how we use evidence around. My favorite example is, it's clear that the need and the impact of this condition is worse or more severe in Black communities. What do we do if the drug isn't as effective for people with African ancestry? What do we do with that? Does it mean that we think it's lower value? Do we think that we should look at everybody as a whole and try to lift all bottoms of the boat? So it raises a lot of interesting questions that will continue to be central to our thinking about how we do the right thing and looking at evidence and bringing it into clinical practice and policy. You heard it from the patients today, but I just also have to reflect briefly that, as a young doctor, lupus it's an insidious, horrible, life-encompassing condition. And the patients were always caught in the cracks between rheumatology and nephrology, between primary care and rheumatology. And the patients were young and trying to work or go to school. Their lives were ruined often. Of course, we only saw maybe the more severe patients in a way, but it was just terrible. And so it really is a celebration to have new treatments like this. And how often do we see brand new drugs, the first of their indication, the first within indication, be priced within shouting distance of a fair cost effectiveness range? Almost never. That's rare. And so we are fortunate to be able to welcome that event. And so that makes me think two things. One is, yes, and on the pricing, because there's still enough patients that this could be a big budget impact hit. And our best estimates of cost effectiveness are highly uncertain given the long-term uncertainty here. So is this not still a situation in which we might want to see a lower price given the uncertainty until we have better data, or some kinds of outcomes-based contracting? And I didn't have time to ask the payers or the manufacturers about it, but you could imagine that with a nice lab test of proteinuria or other ways, we might be able to structure this so that the drugs get even more reward when they work and less when they don't. But let's assume that that the price is relatively well aligned. That leads us to think again about the coverage. And I really appreciate, the participation of the payers. But imagine a quality measure for them that measured 2 years from now how many patients were adhering to treatment with these new treatments, or what percent of patients in their own population who are eligible have had a conversation with a clinician about whether they should start one or the other. It's interesting to think about whether we can broaden our sense of responsibility around health disparities to make sure that health plans help everybody get the news out and get the right patients into the right doctor's offices to have the kinds of conversations that should be had to introduce these kinds of new treatments for them. So a lot of work to be done, but I think we're talking about the right issues. We were really lucky to have such great participants from the patient community with us. And my last thanks go out to the CEPAC with your sincerity of looking at the data, of dealing with the uncertainty, of listening, of integrating so many different factors. You continue to do a really important service for the health system and for our country as we wrestle with these issues. The country's going to be talking a lot about drug pricing and coverage in the coming year, and I think they could do a lot worse than listen into one of the meetings that feature you guys wrestling with it as a guide going forward. So thank you to everybody. I would usually say have a safe trip home, but don't turn around and trip in your own bedrooms. And maybe we will be back together again in person relatively soon. But thanks again to everybody who participated. And we'll be putting up a final report within the next few weeks at most. And the materials will be available on our website. And we'll be capturing the richness of this discussion to the extent that we can, along with the policy recommendations that came from today's discussion. Thank you again to everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.